Hello everyone and welcome to the fourth episode of my React for Beginners tutorial series. Now in this video we are going to be covering class components. Now up until this point in our series you'll see that we've been writing components like functions, literally as variables that are functions. Now of course this syntax is essentially equivalent to saying function card, just like that, except this is a preferred syntax, although this is, for all intents and purposes, a function called card with a capital C that returns a JSX or returns JSX. Now, as you can tell by the name, there are components that are classes instead of functions. And you may be wondering why classes, what's the purpose and all that, and why am I using functions versus classes? Well, all of that is about to be answered. So essentially, in React's history, class components were originally the only components before functions. Functions, I believe, got added. It's 2021. 2 years ago, I want to say, maybe three. I don't, they were actually added fairly recently, maybe not even three. I think either 2 or 1.5 years ago. But essentially, functions are pretty new in the scope of React. Like React, when was the first release of React? 2013. And when was the first release of React with function components? Functions components, or when were function components introduced? 2018. Okay, so actually 3 years ago. Yeah. So essentially the rise of function components was 3 years ago, but React itself is 8 years ago, or is 8 years old. So essentially, just to say, class components have been around for much longer, but function components are the new standard. So in essence, I pulled up this article, just class components versus function components with hooks. This is just a very, you're not going to understand some of this because I haven't covered it yet, but I'm just going to go over. So before React hooks, we had to create, if we wanted to create dynamic components, we had to use class and lifecycle methods. ES6 class, which just means class in JavaScript. You'd have to use mounting and unmounting and all of these things. So essentially, as you can see, this is what a class component looks like. Remember, in a previous episode, I actually said that you used to have to extend React.component. That's exactly what's happening here. That's why you had to import it previously. And of course, you have a constructor, as with every class. If you don't understand, I guess, object-oriented syntax with JavaScript, or really, this is a common syntax here. Like extends, I think, is even part of Java itself. Of course, if you're using C, C++, then you have a class which inherits from, publicly or privately or protected from another class. But essentially, this is a very common pattern. And then you always have a constructor. This constructor essentially initializes the props, and there's something called state, which we haven't gone over, and I will be going over in the next video. Just to clarify, I will not be covering state and lifecycle methods like these. I will not be covering class components. This will be the only video dedicated to class components because, as you will learn, there is actually a performance difference. Function components perform slightly better than class components in terms of time, and they are the current standard. Now, it is worth noting that there is some developer preference, specifically, generally, the older React developers, not age-wise, but, well, literally, like, the React developers that were doing React before before function components generally prefer them, and that's fair. React is not planning to deprecate class components. They will stay inside React for a while, but of course, functions, they have even said it themselves, are the new standard. Should be the new default option. And of course, some developers prefer them because they look a little cleaner once the logic gets very complicated. So either way, like I already kind of said, function components are slightly more performant than class components, although not to the degree that any developer who prefers to use them shouldn't. So if you really like them, then go ahead and leave it down in the comments, and I can actually probably make some extra videos at the end of the series that are dedicated to kind of reteaching everything that I did teach for class components because it's slightly different. Now, of course, you see these functions here: component did mount, component will on mount. These are called lifecycle methods. So this will run when the component mounts for the first time, or what that means is when the component renders for the first time or right before it renders for the first time. You see there's this render function that returns JSX, so you can probably tell this is the return part of the return uh, of the actual function component if you were using that. You can change time, so you see this is a completely custom method. This is not part of React. This user or the programmer created this method, and what it does is it updates the state. Essentially, as you can see, with a class, of course, you can always add member functions. So like this, the change time is a member function, meaning as part of this clock using class React component, you can include extra functions inside it that you can call to make your life easier. Now, of course, this is easily emulated in function components using something called hooks, specifically these. They allow you to have the same functionality. You probably, again, I haven't covered them yet, but you can run code when the component renders for the first time, when it renders every time. You can run, essentially these components can be emulated, these functions to a degree in function components. And state is much easier to manage in function components. It gets very unwieldy in class components in my brief experience with them when I was learning React itself. So overall, this is a lot longer, as you can see. Like this same code could cut down on like these lines here. These lines would turn into one line. These lines would stay the same. These lines would stay the same. This would change into an external function, and these two lines would get removed. So overall, like function components are slightly more compact and are more easily readable, at least for simpler stuff. So either way, enough talking about them. We're going to actually get to writing them, and this is going to be a pretty short video. I can already tell, like 10 minutes probably. So let's go ahead and just check these off. And in essence, all we're going to do is we're going to rewrite one of our components into a class component just to demonstrate how to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and start off. I just realized that my font settings are a little bit small. So there we go. Big again. So I'm going to go ahead and clear. And then I'm going to go ahead and say ls. I'm going to cd into my front end. It's always good to get some terminal practice in if you are still learning the basics of the terminal. And then, of course, to run our project, we're just going to type usually npm run start, but I was not in the right folder. Npm run start to start our React web or our React project, and it'll take just a second to start. There we go. And as you can see, this is where we left off in the previous episode. Now I'm going to go ahead and just mess with the card component, for example. So this is a pretty simple component overall. All we're doing is we're importing our CSS. We are creating the class component as a function, which has props. It takes these and unpacks them and returns. Now I'm going to go ahead and do these side by side. So in order to work with class components, we actually do need to import React as like that, React from, or I think it's a default import from React like that. And then we just have to go class card like this. And of course, we actually have to extend React. So I'm going to comment this out in this form. That way I can see it a little bit easier. Okay, so we have a class card that extends React.component like that with a capital C. And all React classes need to have a render method. and it needs to return some JSX. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab this same JSX from here, like that. And then, of course, header and text are not defined. Now, I actually haven't written, yeah, okay. I haven't written these class components in a while, but okay, so apparently we also need to have a constructor that takes in props because components get initialized with their props. And then you say super props, just like that, which useless constructor. Oh, okay, never mind. Sorry. Um, I was just copying this example here. If you are planning to use state in your component, I'm pretty sure you actually need to do this. But if you do not need state, then you actually don't need a constructor at all. So just keep that in mind. All super means, again, this syntax might look a little confusing. Super just means we call the React.components constructor because super means the one that we are inheriting or extending. So we're just initializing the component with its props, and then we're setting state, which is much simpler in a function component. I didn't mean to close that, but we can open here. So we don't need any sort of constructor, and we just have a render method that returns. And then in order to do header, we just say this dot props, or actually in order to emulate the same um, syntax, I can say const text comma header is equal to this dot props, and this should work. There we go. All right, so as you can see here, we have the same exact looking layout. And if you don't believe me, I will, well, no, that's a little bit of work, but I'll do it. To uncomment these, and then I will recomment this out. So you can see I save, reload. It looks like this. I uncomment out the class component and recomment out the function component, save and reload, and it looks the same. So these are functionally the same. And as you can see at this small scale, these two look the same. And partially the reason for that is we are not using state yet, and we are not using lifecycle methods, in which case this starts to get generally smaller than this. And I think already right now, this is taking up 11 lines of code, and this is taking up 9 lines of code. So it is already smaller, but not considerably. And either way, in order to, or yeah, this is essentially how we render. Now, of course, given this is a class, we can have some utility method like this, as just a normal member function, and maybe this utility method handles returning the card itself, and you have to pass it in some data. For example, um, this is a very weird example, but this could help with this return, and then you could say like this dot some utility method, passing it in um, text and header, just like this. So um, I think I made a syntax mistake here. Let me see 1 second. So returning, I'm not fully sure what I made the mistake with this syntax here. But oh, I used brackets instead of parentheses, but either way, this does work right here. This is a little bit, and I don't know why we're in Vim here, a little bit confusing, but this is working overall. Now, of course, this example seems contrived a bit, but of course, if your component is getting really big, like this is not a card, one method to keep the size of the code down is to split up your returns into a bunch of different methods, like 2 utility methods, and then you can combine the JSX down here in some, you could wrap them around a div or something like that. But in essence, these are generally not preferred anymore. Function components are, as I found in a Stack Overflow comment, at least the new standard. put bluntly, by many developers, but by React itself, a little bit more conservative on that statement. But function components really are becoming the standard. So either way, this was just a quick video to discuss class components, just in case you were wondering. Most React tutorials do cover them a bit. In fact, the one that I used to learn React, the one on Scrimba, still covers all of the lifecycle methods. And I'm not saying that they're not important. Um, I just haven't used them at all in professionally as a React developer, although I have mainly focused on React Native, which is the mobile app development side. But still, most of the code I see nowadays is pretty modern. We use like the latest, you know, aka within the last 3 years, a format of writing React. Everything native, function components, React context instead of Redux, although one of the developers use Redux. And there's many different choices to be made. This is kind of just an illustration that in React or any code library, you're always going to have new and old concepts, ones that have been introduced 3 years ago, ones that have been introduced 8 years ago. And essentially, it is really up to the individual developer and the company that you work at more specifically to choose which one you're using. So of course, if you need class components, I will make more videos after this series or directly, kind of like injected into the end of this series covering some of the most important concepts like lifecycle and state using class components. But either way, we will get to state with function components in the next video. So if you want to see more content like this, I recommend you check out the playlist, which is linked in the description. I'm uploading every 2 days. If you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for notifications whenever I post new videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.